May 17, 1943. Marine Corps Air Station, Majuro, Marshall Islands. Lieutenant James Patrick Donnelly's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear. He'd flown 72 combat missions over Guadalcanal and the Solomons, but from exhaustion, the kind that seeps into bone and sinew and makes a man wonder if he'll ever feel rested again. He stood on the coral runway, salt wind cutting across his face, watching the newest batch of F4U Corsairs being rolled out of their protective revetments. Their distinctive inverted gull wings caught the afternoon light, creating shadows that looked like broken birds. The ground crew called them bent-wing bastards. The pilots had other names, most unprintable. Donnelly traced his fingers along the cowling of Bureau number 17893, still warm from its ferry flight from Pearl Harbor. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine ticked as it cooled. 18 cylinders containing more than 2,000 horses of raw power. More power than any carrier fighter had ever possessed. More power than most pilots knew what to do with. "She's a widowmaker, Lieutenant." Chief Petty Officer Raymond Kowalski emerged from beneath the wing, grease-stained hands holding a checklist that was more prayer than procedure. "Lost 3 pilots last month in landing accidents. The Navy brass wants them grounded until they figure out what the hell is wrong." What was wrong? That was the question everyone asked about the Corsair in those early months. Everything about the design should have made it perfect. Chance Vaught's engineers had created a fighter that could reach speeds approaching 720 kilometers per hour, could climb higher and faster than anything the Japanese flew, could carry 6 Browning 12.7mm machine guns plus rockets and bombs. On paper, it was invincible. On the deck of an aircraft carrier, it was trying to kill you. The Corsair's troubled birth began 32 months earlier, in a Connecticut design studio where engineers faced an impossible problem: how to mount a 13-foot 4-inch propeller necessary to harness the massive R2800 engine, without creating landing gear so tall it would collapse under carrier landing stress. The solution was elegant, almost beautiful. Invert the gull wing, creating a distinctive bend that allowed the propeller clearance while keeping the landing gear struts short and strong. Beauty, however, doesn't forgive aerodynamic sins. The first carrier trials aboard USS Sangamon in September 1942 had been catastrophic. The long nose blocked the pilot's view during the critical final approach, forcing him to execute a curving descent that felt more like faith than flying. The stiff landing gear and narrow wheelbase meant the aircraft bounced on touchdown. Not a gentle skip, but a violent kangaroo hop that could send it over the side or into the island's superstructure. The combination of high wing loading and powerful engine created a vicious left-hand torque that wanted to snap-roll the aircraft into the ocean during the slow speeds required for carrier approach. Admiral John McCain, not the famous senator but his grandfather, then commander of Aircraft South Pacific, had been unequivocal in his assessment. The F4U-1 is not suitable for carrier operations. The words appeared in black typewriter ink on white paper, but they might as well have been carved in stone. By December 1942, the Corsair was officially banned from carrier decks. The Marine Corps, operating from land bases, inherited the reject. Donnelly climbed into the cockpit of 17893 on a Tuesday morning when the humidity hung so thick you could drink it. He'd been assigned to train replacement pilots fresh from Pensacola, young men who still thought war was adventure rather than arithmetic. The cold calculation of fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and the probability of seeing next Thursday. Second Lieutenant Michael Harrigan arrived with the morning supply plane, his uniform still crisp with stateside starch. 22 years old, auburn hair, a photograph of a girl named Dorothy tucked into his shirt pocket. He moved with the unconscious grace of youth, that absolute confidence that death was something that happened to other people. "Is it true what they say about the Corsair, sir?" Harrigan asked, running his hand along the wing route. "That it's the fastest thing in the Pacific?" "It's fast," Donnelly acknowledged, not looking at him. "It'll do 400 miles per hour straight and level, more in a dive. But speed doesn't mean much if you can't land it." The ground crew had a saying, "Any landing you walk away from is a good one." With the Corsair, you were grateful for any landing where you walked away with the same number of bones you started with. That morning, Donnelly took Harrigan through the pre-flight inspection, pointing out the details that kept you alive. The way the oil coolers were mounted in the wing roots, the location of the hydraulic lines for the landing gear, vulnerable to ground fire. The ammunition boxes for the Brownings, 300 rounds per gun, 4,200 rounds total, enough to make a Zero look like Swiss cheese, but gone in 14 seconds of sustained fire. The visibility is shit, Donnelly said, standing on the wing beside the cockpit. That nose is over 14 feet long. During landing approach, you can't see the deck until you're almost on it. So you come in on a curve, bank left, keep the carrier in sight out your side window, straighten out at the last second and pray. What about the bounce? I heard. You heard right. The landing gear is stiff as a board. It doesn't absorb shock worth a damn. You come in too fast, you bounce. You come in too slow, you stall and drop like a stone. The margin is about 3 knots. 3 knots between bouncing off the deck and killing yourself. Harrigan's hand moved unconsciously to the photograph in his pocket, the gesture of a man recalculating odds. Why do we still fly them? Donnelly finally looked at him. Really looked. Saw himself 5 years ago, before Guadalcanal, before the Solomons, before he'd learned that war wasn't about glory, but about showing up day after day, even when your hands shook and your dreams were full of burning aircraft. Because, Donnelly said slowly, when you get it into the air, when you push that throttle forward and feel those 2,000 horses pulling you up, when you point the nose at a Zero and feel the Browning's hammer, there's nothing else like it. The Japanese can't touch us. The K-43 Oscar, the A6M Zero, even their newest fighters, we're faster, we're stronger, we can outdive anything they have. They can turn better, but if you don't try to turn with them, if you use your speed and altitude, you're invincible. He paused, remembering something Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn had said after shooting down his 6-0. The Corsair doesn't dogfight, it kills. So we learn to land it, Donnelly finished, or we die trying. The modifications began arriving piecemeal throughout 1943, each one a small redemption, an acknowledgement that perhaps the aircraft wasn't fatally flawed, just misunderstood. In April, new fighters arrived with a raised pilot seat in a bulged canopy, Malcolm Hood they called it, that added inches of visibility. It wasn't much, but much isn't what matters in aviation. Inches matter. Inches are the difference between seeing the deck and hitting the island. In June, engineers redesigned the landing gear, extending the strut by 8 inches. The change was subtle, almost invisible to casual inspection, but it transformed the aircraft's behavior on touchdown. The steeper angle of attack on approach improved both visibility and handling. The bounce didn't disappear. Physics couldn't be defeated, only negotiated, but it became manageable, predictable, a challenge rather than a death sentence. In August, new wing flaps arrived, modified to deploy at slightly different angles. The change affected stall characteristics, making the aircraft more forgiving at low speeds. Landing speed came down from 95 knots to 87, 8 knots, a trivial number on paper, a lifetime in the air. Donnelly watched each change with the skepticism of a man who'd seen promising modifications fail. But slowly, grudgingly, he began to trust the aircraft. The Corsair was learning to be civilized. November 3, 1943, 120 miles northeast of Bougainville. The radio crackled with static and panic. Bandits, 12 o'clock high, multiple contacts. Donnelly snapped his head up, scanning the pale morning sky. There, sunlight glinting off metal, still 4,000 feet above them. He counted 8, no, 10, no, Jesus, 14 aircraft in loose formation. Zeros, their characteristic profile unmistakable even at this distance. Blue flight, this is Blue Leader. Tactical 1-7, I say again, Tactical 1-7. The formation broke, 4 Corsairs climbing in a wide helix, trading airspeed for altitude. The massive R-2800 engines roared, propellers clawing at thin air, climbing at 3,000 feet per minute, twice what the Zeros could manage. This was what the Corsair was built for, not the cramped confines of a carrier deck, but the vast three-dimensional battlefield of the Pacific sky, where speed and power trumped maneuverability, where physics was judge and jury. The Zeros dove to intercept, but they were too late. Donnelly's formation had the altitude now, had the energy, had the initiative. He rolled inverted and pulled through, the horizon spinning, ocean becoming sky becoming ocean, until his nose pointed at the lead Zero. The enemy pilot saw him coming, tried to turn, but the Corsair's 400-mile-per-hour dive was inexorable as gravity. Donnelly's thumb found the firing button. 6 Browning M2s erupted, their combined cyclic rate pumping 72 rounds per second into a cone of destruction. Tracers drew lines of fire through morning air. The Zero disintegrated. There was no other word for it. The wings folded, the fuselage crumpled, and then it was tumbling fragments of aluminum and burning aviation fuel. He pulled out of the dive at 8,000 feet, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, his vision tunneling, the world going gray at the edges. The Corsair's airframe groaned but held. 2,000 pounds of aircraft and pilot, pulling 7 Gs, and the bent wings held. Blue 3, you have 1 on your 6. Harrigan, the kid from Pensacola with the picture of Dorothy. Donnelly's head snapped right, searching. There, 300 yards back and low. Harrigan's Corsair with a Zero glued to his tail. The Japanese pilot firing in short bursts, walking his rounds toward the American fighter. Donnelly didn't think. Thinking takes time. He pushed the throttle to the firewall, felt the R2800 respond with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat. The airspeed indicator climbed. 320 knots, 350, 380. The Zero couldn't match it. The American aircraft pulled ahead, pulled a beam, pulled in front of the enemy fighter. Brake right, Blue 3, brake right now. Harrigan's Corsair snapped into a violent turn, the G-forces surely graying out the young pilot. The Zero, committed to his firing pass, couldn't follow. For 1 heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, 3 heartbeats, the Japanese fighter floated in Donnelly's gun sight, perfectly aligned, perfectly doomed. The Browning spoke again. The Zero's engine exploded, pieces of the radial flying apart in different directions, oil streaming back in black ropes. The aircraft nosed over, trailing smoke, falling toward the ocean 20,000 feet below. The pattern repeated across the Pacific throughout late 1943 and into 1944. The Corsair, exiled from carriers, found its calling in land-based Marine squadrons. From Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, from Munda Point on New Georgia, from Torquina on Bougainville, from Peleliu and Iwo Jima, the bent-wing fighters flew their missions. The statistics told a story that squadron commanders reviewed with something approaching disbelief. 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. For every Corsair lost in air combat, 11 enemy fighters fell from the sky. The Japanese called it whistling death for the sound the aircraft made in a dive, air screaming through the oil cooler intakes. American pilots called it their ticket home. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, commanding VMF 214, shot down 28 Japanese aircraft in Corsairs before being shot down himself and spending the rest of the war in a prison camp. Second Lieutenant Robert Hansen, flying with VMF 215, destroyed 25 enemy aircraft in 17 days before being killed in a ground attack mission. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh became the first Corsair pilot to receive the Medal of Honor after shooting down 21 Japanese aircraft. The numbers accumulated like evidence in a trial. F4U pilots shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 189 Corsairs to enemy action. The rejected fighter, the aircraft too dangerous for carriers, became the most lethal air superiority platform in the Pacific theater. But the Navy still wouldn't let it onto carriers. April 19, 1944. USS Bunker Hill, Pacific Ocean, 300 miles east of Truk. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn stood on the flight deck, watching the latest modified Corsairs being positioned for trials. The wind across the deck was steady at 32 knots, perfect carrier wind. The sea was relatively calm, long Pacific swells under clear skies. Conditions couldn't be better. He'd volunteered for this, the carrier qualification trials with the newest modifications. Someone had to prove the aircraft could do it, that the changes weren't just incremental improvements, but fundamental transformations. The modifications had continued throughout the year. The stall strip on the starboard wing leading edge, a tiny piece of metal that forced that wing to stall first, countering the torque tendency. The refined landing gear oleo struts with better shock absorption. The revised approach speed procedures. The new technique of coming in with power on, controlling descent rate with throttle rather than with angle of attack. Each change alone was minor. Together, they represented a philosophy shift. Don't fight the aircraft's nature, work with it. Blackburn climbed into the cockpit, ran through the pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision he'd used for 3 years and 217 combat missions. Engine start, hydraulics, electrical, trim. The R2800 caught on the fourth blade, settled into its characteristic rough idle. The sound vibrated through the airframe, through his seat, through his chest, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The launch was routine. The Corsair had always been good at launches. Catapult tension, throttle full, salute to the deck officer, acceleration that crushed you back against armor plate, and then suddenly you were flying, the carrier falling away behind, the ocean spreading blue and infinite below. He flew the pattern slowly, deliberately, thinking through each step. The key was power management. Keep the power on during approach. Don't chop the throttle until you're over the deck. Use the throttle like an elevator control, adding power to arrest descent, reducing it to sink. The old technique, cutting power and gliding in, was what killed pilots. The Corsair didn't glide worth a damn. The approach turn, bank left, keep the deck visible through the side window. The new canopy helped. He could actually see where he was going. Straighten out. The landing signal officer stood on his platform, paddles extended. The deck rushed toward him, huge and tiny simultaneously, a postage stamp floating on infinity. Roger Ball. 3/4 of a mile, 600 feet altitude, 140 knots. Throttle back slightly, 120 knots. 400 feet. The landing signal officer's paddles. Little high, come down, throttle back. Descent rate increasing, 110 knots, 200 feet. Paddles, you're good, hold what you got. 100 knots, 100 feet. The deck detail becoming visible, tie-down points, arresting cables, deck crew in their colored jerseys. 90 knots, 50 feet. The paddles went to cut, the signal to chop power. Blackburn chopped the throttle. The Corsair settled, dropping those last feet not in a glide but in a controlled descent. The massive engine idling but still producing thrust. The propeller's momentum keeping airflow over the wings. The wheels touched. The familiar bounce but softer now, controlled. The tail hook caught the 3-wire arresting cable. The deceleration slammed him forward against his harness. -4 Gs, 0 to stop in 2 seconds and 150 feet. He'd landed a Corsair on a carrier. The deck crew was already rushing forward, unhooking the arresting cable, directing him to fold the wings and taxi forward. Blackburn looked out at the faces. Flight deck officers, plane directors, the catapult crew. They were smiling. Some were cheering. The bent wing bastard had come home. By September 1944, the Navy reversed its decision. The Corsair was cleared for carrier operations. VMF 124 and VMF 213 deployed aboard USS Essex. More squadrons followed. By the war's end, 19 carrier-based Corsair squadrons were operating from 10 fleet carriers, flying combat air patrol, fighter sweeps, and ground attack missions. The aircraft that couldn't land on carriers became the Navy's primary carrier fighter, serving not just through the end of World War II, but through Korea, where it flew ground attack missions with rockets and napalm. The last combat sortie by a piston engine fighter in American service was flown by a Corsair in 1953, more than a decade after the Navy had declared it unsuitable for carrier operations. Production continued until December 1952, 12,571 Corsairs built. More than any other American fighter except the P-47 Thunderbolt. They served with the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marines, Royal Navy, Royal New Zealand Air Force, and French Navy. They flew from carriers, from jungle airstrips, from coral runways blasted out of Pacific atolls. The final combat kill credited to a Corsair came in September 1952, when Captain Jesse Brown, one of the Navy's first African-American aviators, used his F4U-4 to shoot down a North Korean Yak-9. Brown was killed 2 months later, not by enemy action, but by a forced landing behind enemy lines. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Hudner, deliberately crash-landed his own Corsair, attempting to rescue Brown, an act that earned Hudner the Medal of Honor, but couldn't save his friend's life. May 8, 1945. VMF 323 Ready Room, Kadena Airfield, Okinawa. Donnelly sat in the worn leather chair, flight suit stained with salt and sweat, reading the telegram for the third time. Germany had surrendered. In Europe, the war was over. Here in the Pacific, it ground on, but everyone knew it was ending. The question wasn't whether Japan would surrender, but when, and how many more would die before that day came. Harrigan sat across from him, no longer the fresh-faced kid who'd arrived with Dorothy's picture 2 years ago. His hair had started graying at the temples. He was 24 years old with gray hair. Dorothy had married someone else, a stateside officer who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Harrigan kept her picture anyway, a memento of who he'd been before he learned what killing felt like. "What do you think you'll do, Lieutenant?" Harrigan asked. "After, I mean." Donnelly looked up from the telegram. After. The word seemed foreign, a sound from another language. There had been no after, only the endless present of missions and maintenance, of combat reports and casualty lists. "I don't know," he admitted. "Go home, I suppose, Nebraska. My dad has a farm. I could help him with that." "You think you'll miss it? Flying, I mean." Donnelly glanced through the ready room window at the flight line. 24 Corsairs sat parked in their revetments, their bent wings casting familiar shadows across the coral runway. Behind them, B-29 bombers lumbered into the air, heading north toward the Japanese home islands, carrying death in their bomb bays. "I'll miss the aircraft," he said finally. "The Corsair, it's a son of a bitch to land, temperamental as hell, tries to kill you if you're not paying attention. But when you're up there, when you've got the altitude and the speed, when everything's working right, there's a moment of perfection, pure, clean. Just you and the machine in the sky." He paused, searching for words that couldn't quite capture what he meant. "The war is something else. The war I won't miss at all." The Corsair's reputation outlived the war, outlived even the aircraft themselves. When pilots spoke of World War II fighters, they spoke of the Spitfire's elegance, the Mustang's range, the Thunderbolt's durability. But they spoke of the Corsair with something different, something harder to define. Respect, perhaps, or recognition that excellence often comes disguised as trouble. The bent-winged bird that couldn't land became the fighter that wouldn't quit. The Widowmaker became the lifesaver. The Reject became the legend. In 1976, during America's bicentennial celebration, the Navy flew a restored F4U-4 in formation over Washington, D.C. The pilot was a woman, Lieutenant Barbara Allen Rainey, one of the first female Navy pilots. She took the Corsair through a series of victory rolls over the Washington Monument, the massive Pratt and Whitney engine roaring, the distinctive gull wings catching afternoon light exactly as they had caught light over Pacific Islands 3 decades earlier. Donnelly watched it on television from a nursing home in Grand Island, Nebraska. 83 years old, emphysema and arthritis and the accumulated damage of life. When the Corsair appeared on screen, rolling against blue sky, he straightened in his chair. His hands, spotted with age and trembling with palsy, moved unconsciously to grip an invisible control stick. "That's the one," he told the nurse who'd stopped to watch with him. "That's the bird I flew." She smiled politely, not understanding. How could she? She'd been born after the war, grown up in a world where the Pacific theater was history lessons and black and white photographs, where the Corsair was a museum piece, where the bent-wing fighters existed only in memory and restoration. But Donnelly remembered. He remembered the scream of the R-2800 engine at full throttle, the hammer of 6 Brownings firing, the impossible angle of carrier deck rushing toward him. The moment, always the same moment, when the wheels touched and you knew you'd survived another landing. He remembered learning to trust an aircraft that tried to kill him and being rewarded with perfection. On the television, the Corsair completed its final roll and climbed away, banking west toward Virginia. the sun catching its canopy like a signal, like goodbye, like the end of something that couldn't quite end because it had become part of the men who flew it, written into their nervous systems and dreams. Donnelly closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was flying.